In 2006, a group of gold miners working a valley in eastern Mongolia called Salkit hit something in the dirt that clearly wasn't ore. It was a skull cap, the dome of a human head, oddly shaped, oddly thick, unlike anything the local researchers who examined it had seen before. For over a decade, nobody could agree on what it actually was. Some early assessments floated the idea that it might be Homo erectus, a species that vanished from the fossil record hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans existed. Others suspected Neanderthal. For a while, it even carried an informal nickname, Mongolanthropus, a placeholder name for a mystery. Nobody had the tools to solve. It sat in that limbo for 14 years, the only ice age human fossil ever found in the entire country of Mongolia, its true identity locked inside bone that nobody could read yet. Then, in 2020, a team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology finally cracked it open, not with a hammer or a scalpel, but with a sequencer. And what came out of that? Skull rewrote a meaningful chunk of the map of how humans actually moved across Asia during the last ice age. Before we get into exactly what they found, it's worth being precise about the numbers, because a lot of what circulates online about this discovery inflates them well past what the actual published science says, and the true figures are genuinely dramatic enough without any exaggeration. The Salkit individual has been dated through direct radiocarbon analysis of the bone itself to approximately 34,000 years old, not 60,000, a figure that occasionally gets rounded up or confused online with dates belonging to entirely different fossils in different regions. That distinction matters, because 34,000 years already places her firmly within one of the most consequential and least understood windows in the story of modern humans spreading across Eurasia, a period when our species was still actively sharing the continent with at least one other kind of human. And the genetic evidence recovered from her skull turned out to be some of the clearest proof of that overlap ever recovered from East Asia. Getting the number right isn't a small, pedantic correction either. It's the difference between a fossil sitting comfortably within an already well-documented window of human migration and one that would, if the 60,000-year figure were actually accurate, sit right at the very edge of when modern humans are believed to have first pushed out of Africa at all, an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence nobody has actually published. Let's back up and set the stage properly, because the context makes the discovery land with its full weight. By the time the Salkit woman was alive, Homo sapiens had been present outside Africa for tens of thousands of years already, but Asia at that moment was not the exclusively modern human landscape we tend to picture when we think of the deep past. Neanderthals still occupied parts of western and central Eurasia, and further east, across Siberia and into parts of East and Southeast Asia, a separate, genuinely mysterious population known as the Denisovans was still present, a group so poorly represented in the fossil record that, for years, almost everything scientists knew about them came exclusively from a handful of bone fragments, a finger bone, and a few teeth recovered from a single cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, plus, much later, a jawbone pulled from a cave on the Tibetan Plateau. Modern humans moving east across the Eurasian steppe during this period weren't walking into empty territory. They were walking into a landscape still shared, in some places, with other human lineages entirely. Archaeological evidence has continued pushing the timeline of that eastward movement earlier and earlier. A separate study, led by archaeologist Nicholas Wins of UC Davis, examined stone tools recovered from a site called Tolbor 16, along the Tolbor River in Mongolia's northern Hanggai Mountains, and used luminescence dating on the surrounding sediment alongside radiocarbon dating of nearby animal bone to establish that modern humans were already moving across the Mongolian steppe, roughly 45,000 years ago, about 10,000 years earlier than researchers had previously assumed. That date lines up almost precisely with genetic estimates for when modern humans and Denisovans are believed to have first crossed paths in this region, meaning Mongolia wasn't some remote, marginal corner of the human migration story. It was very likely one of the actual contact zones, one of the places where our species and its now extinct cousins directly encountered each other, which brings us back to the skull from Salkit and to what the genome hidden inside it actually revealed once researchers, led by geneticist Diendo Masilani, finally sequenced it in full. The first findings settled the identity question that had lingered for 14 years. The Salkit individual was not Homo erectus. She was not Neanderthal. She was a fully modern human, Homo sapiens, a woman who lived roughly 34,000 years ago, making her, at the time of the study's publication, the oldest human fossil found anywhere in Mongolia. That alone would have been a satisfying resolution to a genuinely old mystery. But the genome held something else, something that turned this from a straightforward identification into a story about movement, mixing, and how interconnected the ancient world actually was, far earlier than most people assume. When Masolani's team analyzed her ancestry in detail, they found that roughly 25% of her genome traced back to Western Eurasian populations, groups whose ancestors, at that point in history, were centered thousands of kilometers away, associated with regions stretching toward the Caucasus and the broader area west of the Ural Mountains. A quarter of her DNA had roots in a population geographically distant enough that, on a modern map, you'd expect to find almost no genetic overlap between them and a woman living on the Mongolian steppe, roughly 34,000 years before any of the transportation or communication technology we take for granted existed. Masolani summarized the significance of that finding plainly. This was direct evidence that modern human communities in East Asia were already remarkably cosmopolitan earlier than 34,000 years ago, proof that migration and interaction between populations spread out across the entire Eurasian continent were already happening frequently by that point, not as a rare exceptional event, but as an established pattern. The comparison that made this finding land even harder came from a second individual, a roughly 40,000-year-old man recovered from Tianyuan Cave, just outside modern Beijing, whose genome had already been sequenced in earlier research. When researchers compared the Salkit woman's genome against the Tianyuan man's, despite the two of them being separated by both geography and up to several thousand years, they found the two individuals were genetically related, part of the same broadly connected early East Asian population network, rather than representing two isolated, unconnected pockets of humanity that happened to end up in roughly the same part of the world by coincidence. And then there was the detail that made the biggest splash in the scientific press. Using a genetic analysis method specifically developed at the Max Planck Institute to detect faint traces of DNA from extinct hominin lineages buried within modern human genomes, the team found that both the Salkit woman and the Tianyuan man carried segments of Denisovan ancestry, alongside the more commonly documented Neanderthal segments already known to be present in nearly all non-African populations. This was concrete, direct genetic proof that modern humans in this specific region, at this specific, remarkably early point in the story of our species spread across Asia, were not just aware of Denisovans as some rumor drifting through neighboring territories. They were interbreeding with them, closely enough and recently enough relative to these individuals' own lifetimes, that identifiable fragments of that ancestry were still traceable in their genomes tens of thousands of years later. It's worth understanding, at least briefly, what it actually takes to pull a readable genome out of a 34,000-year-old skull, because the technical achievement here is almost as remarkable as the result itself. DNA begins breaking down the moment the organism dies, fragmenting into shorter and shorter pieces as the years pass, while contamination from soil bacteria, fungi, and especially once a specimen reaches a lab, modern human handlers steadily dilutes whatever genuine ancient material remains. For years, this made genuine ancient genome sequencing something close to a lottery, dependent entirely on whether a particular specimen happened to be preserved in unusually favorable conditions. The breakthrough that changed this, developed largely at the Max Planck Institute over the past decade and a half, involves targeting one particular part of the skeleton, the petrous bone, the extremely dense pyramid-shaped section of the skull that houses the inner ear. Because it's so much denser than the rest of the skeleton, the petrous bone tends to protect whatever genetic material survives inside it far better than any other part of the body, acting almost like a natural vault. Researchers extract microscopic bone powder from this specific region, then use increasingly refined chemical and computational techniques to separate genuine ancient DNA fragments from the much larger volume of modern contamination and bacterial genetic material inevitably mixed in alongside it, before finally reconstructing a usable genome out of what are often disappointingly small, degraded fragments. It's a slow, expensive, failure-prone process even now, and it's exactly why a specimen like Salkit, discovered by accident outside any controlled excavation, sitting in storage for over a decade before the right technique and the right funding lined up, represents such a genuine, hard-won scientific achievement rather than a routine lab procedure. Step back and look at what these two skeletons, found in different countries, separated by real distance and possibly by thousands of years, actually demonstrate together. A woman on the Mongolian steppe carrying a quarter of her ancestry from populations centered far to the west. A man outside modern Beijing, genetically connected to that same woman despite the distance between them, both of them carrying inherited fragments of Denisovan DNA, physical proof of encounters with an entirely separate, largely fossilless human lineage. This is not the picture of small, isolated bands of early humans, each cut off in their own corner of the continent, slowly evolving in place with minimal outside contact. It's a picture of a genuinely interconnected Ice Age world, one where people and the populations they occasionally mixed with were moving across enormous distances and making contact with each other far earlier and far more routinely than the traditional textbook narrative of slow, gradual, mostly isolated regional settlement ever really allowed for. This matters for a reason that goes well beyond one skull in one museum collection, because it's part of a much larger pattern that ancient DNA research keeps confirming over and over across completely different parts of the world. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists studying human prehistory worked almost entirely from material culture, pottery styles, tool types, burial customs, comparing how similar or different these things looked across different sites to make educated guesses about which populations had contact with each other and which stayed largely separate. Ancient DNA changed that completely, because it lets researchers answer the same question directly at the level of actual biological relatedness, rather than inferring it indirectly from the objects people happen to leave behind. And time after time, in region after region, the genetic evidence has revealed far more movement, far more mixing, and far more long-distance contact than the material culture alone ever suggested. A landmark set of studies published in Nature in 2018, led by geneticist David Reich at Harvard, more than doubled the total number of ancient human genomes available for study at the time, expanding the published record from a few hundred individuals to well over 1,300, and traced a massive migration of steppe pastoralist populations spreading outward from the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas, stretching as far west as the Atlantic coast of Europe and as far east as Mongolia and India, reshaping the genetic makeup of huge swaths of the continent within a relatively short span of prehistoric time, and helping explain the spread of the Indo-European language family across an enormous geographic range. In parts of Britain, that later steppe migration is now estimated to have replaced as much as 90% of the existing local gene pool within a few centuries, a staggering demographic turnover that no amount of pottery style comparison alone would ever have revealed on its own. Reich himself has described this steppe expansion as one of the clearest demonstrations of just how much raw migratory power ancient DNA can uncover, that traditional archaeology, working from artifacts alone, simply couldn't see. The Salkit discovery pushes that same basic lesson. People moved, people mixed, far. More than we assumed, back thousands of years earlier than that later steppe migration into the depths of the last ice age itself. It's worth pausing on just how remarkable it is that any of this could be recovered at all, because ancient DNA work in this part of the world runs into exactly the kind of preservation obstacles that have made similar research so difficult elsewhere. Mongolia's climate, extreme seasonal temperature swings, long stretches of dry cold, isn't quite as hostile to DNA preservation as the humid conditions that have made Mesopotamian and Southeast Asian ancient DNA research so difficult, but it's still a demanding environment. And the fact that any usable genetic material survived intact inside a 34,000-year-old skullcap, exposed by mining activity rather than a careful, controlled excavation, speaks to just how far extraction and sequencing techniques have advanced over the past 2 decades. 14 years passed between the Salkit skull's discovery and the moment researchers finally had both the technology and the funding to read what was actually locked inside it. A reminder that a huge amount of what we know about deep human history isn't limited by what's sitting in the ground waiting to be found. It's limited by how long it takes science to catch up to material that's often been sitting in a drawer or a display case for years, waiting for the right tool to finally arrive. There's a related piece of this broader Siberian and Central Asian puzzle that deserves its own mention because it shows just how far these deep genetic threads actually reach, stretching all the way to populations most people would never think to connect to ancient Mongolia at all. In 2009, researchers excavating a site called Malta near Lake Baikal in south-central Siberia, not far from Mongolia's own northern border, recovered the remains of a young boy who had died roughly 24,000 years ago. When his genome was finally sequenced and published in Nature in 2014 by a team led by geneticist Eske Villerslev, the results stunned researchers studying the peopling of the Americas. The Malta boy's DNA showed no meaningful connection to East Asian populations at all, despite his remains being found in Siberia. In the general region, most textbooks point to as the staging ground for the migration into the Americas. Instead, his genome carried a mixture of ancestry linking him to both Western Eurasian populations and to a previously undocumented lineage researchers now call ancient North Eurasian, a population that turned out to have contributed a substantial share, in some estimates around a third, of the ancestry of every indigenous population across North and South America. In other words, part of the deep genetic story of the Americas doesn't trace back cleanly through East Asia at all, but through this separate, once unknown Siberian lineage that the Malta boy's genome first revealed. It's a powerful illustration of the exact same lesson the Salkit skull teaches, that the population history of this entire region, stretching from the Ural Mountains through Siberia and Mongolia, and eventually across the Bering Land Bridge into a whole new hemisphere, was never the simple, single-file migration route the old textbook maps like to draw. It was a tangle of overlapping, mixing populations, and every new genome recovered from the region keeps adding another thread to that tangle rather than simplifying it. There's also a broader mystery still tangled up in all of this that the Salkit findings only partially resolve, and it's worth being honest about what remains genuinely unsettled. Denisovans themselves remain one of the strangest, least understood branches of the human family. Tree precisely because of how little physical evidence of them has ever been recovered. For close to 15 years after their initial identification from that single finger bone in Siberia, researchers had almost nothing to work with beyond scattered teeth, a jawbone, and the genetic echoes left behind inside modern human populations, particularly strong in parts of Oceania, where some groups carry as much as 4 to 5% Denisovan ancestry, the highest levels recorded anywhere on Earth. It wasn't until 2025 that a large fossil skull, discovered decades earlier in Harbin, China, and initially misclassified as a distinct new species entirely, was finally confirmed through preserved dental plaque DNA to actually belong to a Denisovan individual, giving researchers, for the first time, an actual face to associate with a lineage that had, until that point, existed almost entirely as fragments and genetic inference. The Salkit and Tianyuan genomes fit into that same unfolding story, more indirect evidence of exactly how widespread Denisovan populations and modern human contact with them really were across ancient Asia, even as the physical fossil record documenting exactly what these populations looked like and where all of their communities actually lived remains frustratingly thin. So, does a discovery like this actually rewrite the map of human migration, the way a dramatic headline might promise? In a real, substantive sense, yes, though not in the way that phrase usually gets used to imply some kind of complete demolition of everything scientists previously believed. What it does is correct and sharpen a map that was already being redrawn, replacing an older assumption of slow, mostly isolated regional population growth, with a far more accurate picture of frequent long-distance contact and mixing happening across the Eurasian continent tens of thousands of years earlier than most people, including plenty of working archaeologists a generation ago, would have guessed. It adds Mongolia, a region long treated as a peripheral footnote in most tellings of the human migration story, directly into the center of one of the most important open chapters in that story, the actual physical overlap between modern humans and Denisovans. And it does all of that through a single skullcap, pulled out of a pit by people who had no idea at the time that they were holding evidence that would eventually help rewrite our understanding of how connected the ancient world genuinely was. One more question naturally follows from all of this, and it's one the original research team addressed directly. Does any of this ancestry actually persist in Mongolia today? Or did the Salkit woman's lineage simply vanish, replaced entirely by later migrations the way so many other ancient populations eventually were? The honest answer, based on the comparisons researchers have run so far, is that the genetic picture in this part of Asia looks less like continuous unbroken descent and more like layer after layer of population turnover and mixing, stretching across tens of thousands of years. The same pattern that keeps showing up almost everywhere. Ancient DNA research has been applied in enough depth. Modern Mongolian populations carry ancestry shaped by much later migrations, including the sweeping demographic changes associated with the rise of the Mongol Empire and centuries of contact with neighboring populations across Central and East Asia, layered on top of whatever deeper connection may or may not trace back toward populations like the one the Salkit woman belonged to. That doesn't make her any less significant to the region's history. If anything, it reinforces the larger point this entire discovery keeps illustrating, that population history essentially everywhere on Earth is built from repeated waves of arrival, mixing, and replacement, rather than a single unbroken line running in a straight, uninterrupted path from one ancient ancestor down to everyone living in the same location today. The honest, forward-looking part of this story is that Salkit is very likely not going to stay a unique case for long. Ancient DNA extraction techniques keep improving year over year, and researchers across Mongolia, Siberia, and northern China are actively working through museum collections and new excavations alike, looking for exactly this kind of overlooked specimen, bones that were pulled from the ground decades ago, misidentified, or simply left unstudied because the technology to read them properly didn't exist yet. If one accidental mining discovery could rewrite this much of the picture once modern, sequencing finally caught up to it, it's a reasonable bet that more corrections and more genuinely surprising confirmations of just how mobile and interconnected our Ice Age ancestors actually were are still sitting out there, waiting on exactly the same kind of patient, unglamorous scientific catch-up that finally gave a 14-year-old mystery skull its name, her age, and her genuinely remarkable story. There's a fitting kind of symmetry in how this particular mystery finally got solved. A skull pulled out of a Mongolian hillside by people looking for gold, mistaken for over a decade for a completely different, far older species, ends up holding something considerably more valuable than what the miners were actually digging for that day. Direct genetic proof that the isolated, slow-moving picture of Ice Age humanity most of us grew up picturing was never quite right. The real Ice Age world, at least in this corner of it, looked less like scattered, self-contained tribes slowly evolving in place across thousands of generations, and more like a genuinely connected, if sparsely populated network, one where a woman living on the Mongolian steppe could carry ancestry from populations thousands of kilometers to the west, share genetic ties with a man buried near modern Beijing, and both of them could carry, quietly encoded in cells that wouldn't be read for another 34,000 years, physical proof of encounters, with an entirely different branch of humanity that vanished long before either of them was born. That's the actual story hiding inside one small, oddly shaped piece of skull. No exaggerated 60,000-year date required, just the real number and the real, patiently reconstructed history behind it, which turns out to be more than dramatic enough on its own.